So, hi everyone to this latest episode of the Biome podcast. And again, our theme is a really big conservation issue. And so we've got me, Robi, and Emma and Kate. And today we're going to be talking to you about zoos, which I'm sure quite a few people have quite a few strong opinions on, as ever. We're going to come at this from as unbiased an angle as we can. We're going to go through all the evidence that, would be for zoos and against zoos. And at the end of it, we're going to come to our opinions on them and why we think they're good or bad, what their role in conservation is today and what it has been in the past and what it could be in the future. So we are going to start with a little introduction. What are we talking about when we're talking about zoos?
So a zoo basically describes a collection of living animals, and originally the purpose of zoos was pretty much purely for entertainment, but now they kind of serve an important role in conservation as education centres to teach people more about animals. And zoos are actually the most visited conservation sites, which actually probably isn't that surprising. With the World Zoo Conservation Strategy estimating that there are about 1,100 organised zoos in the world, receiving more than 600 million visitors annually.
Wow, that's a lot.
That's more than Virunga gets, put it that way.
Yeah, and globally it's also thought that there are about 2,107 aquaria and zoos in 125 countries. There are also many private collections. The BIAZA, which stands for the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquariums, is a professional body which represents the best zoos and aquariums in the UK and Ireland. They have over 100 zoos and aquarium members, and being a part of this means that members have to commit to be at the forefront of conservation, education and research. And it's the idea of kind of being more than just a place where the public can go to view a range of different animals. They're really dedicated to research and conservation programs, as well as inspiring visitors to do the same. And so zoos accredited in this way must meet the highest standards for animal care and welfare. So it's a really important thing to kind of look out for when you're visiting zoos. So BIAZA members are also members of the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, called WAZA. And
that's cool. I love that.
BIAZA, WAZA.
It's great. It just sounds like a party, doesn't it? And also there's the European Association of Zoos and Aquarium, which is EAZA.
Another one.
Another great one, yeah. And a key discriminating feature between zoos is the extent to which they engage in conservation. So zoos, by and large, receive no government funding. So they are private entities. So their primary source of income is fees by paid visitors. So that means zoos are kind of trapped in this awkward position of balancing the welfare and conservation of their animals with the need to provide visitors with a good experience so they can return. But they've also got to think about their profits. And where
I guess at the moment
from.
this is so hard. As a result of COVID-19, zoos have been hit incredibly hard. They've been shut for probably more months than they've been open in 2020. And that, like you just said, Kate, that is a huge financial means of where they get all their money from. They must be really, really struggling at the moment.
Yeah, because they are a business at the end of the day.
And so my first introduction to that, I did a zookeeper training course, I think maybe 5 years ago. And during this training course, we were, doing a module on kind of enrichment and enclosure design. And we were kind of, being taught all the things you need to know. And zoos generally have to have a 50-50 balance of enclosure design with 50% for the animal's benefit and 50% for public viewing in mind, to ensure that people do return. So, as this is one of the really interesting things that I found when researching this document, the difference between how easy it is as zoologists and ecologists who don't work in a zoo to kind of really idealistically say, no, it has to be 100% about the animal, yada, yada, yada. But, if I ran a zoo, enclosures would be the size of Ireland. But actually, the zoo I was part of doing that training thing funds conservation organisations all over the world. And so this is the kind of slightly paradoxical thing we're going to really try and unpack with this episode and kind of give you a bit of an overview about. So obviously, zoos do have the potential to be incredibly useful. And I think Emma's going to tell you a bit about this now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like zoos are what inspire so many kids to get into animals or conservation in the first place, because if you think about it, it's incredible seeing them on television or reading books about animals, but nothing quite beats that personal connection that you have with one when you are this close to a gorilla, for example, and you have that connection. So I often think with that, especially with children, that it instigates this curiosity about the natural world and about animals, so that they can then go home, they can look up more about the animals. And zoos now, they also have a lot of information about animals in the wild and threats that are facing these animals in their natural habitat. So it's not just go to a zoo, leave and be like, oh, that was really nice, we saw some cute animals, okay, move on with my day. It's like, wow, okay, we saw a polar bear, we also read a notice board about climate change and global warming, and also, oh yeah, they said this thing that we could do which could help these animals in the wild. So I think that's a vital role that zoos have now. And I guess
I think, you know, I can personally testify that I'm sure you guys have completely similar experiences. But as someone who, most of my love for the animal kingdom in my early years was through television, not zoos, and, you know, seeing Planet Earth. But the first time I ever went to Jersey Zoo, which is the headquarters of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation organisation, I went to the lemur enclosure, which is this fantastic massive pond with all these reed beds, and they had these Lake Alautra gentle lemurs, which are these tiny, tiny little golden brown lemurs just sitting there. And, you know, I try to be quite critical when it comes to my, you know, ecology thinking, and I try not to get emotional when it comes to animals, but I went back 2 days in a row and I just sat there and stared at these lemurs. Aww. And I read everything about this particular species and how their lakeside home is being slashed and burned, and I've never felt a more powerful moment of any animal in captivity than that moment. So it might sound wishy-washy, but it really is true. Zoos can have this massive impact.
Yeah, no, I'd fully agree, and I think so many people like you would have had an experience like that in a zoo, where people often live in cities, in really urban areas. How would you expect to get those kind of animal-human interactions without zoos? And also, I guess, to put it into a bigger context, is we are currently in the middle of a 6th mass extinction caused by humans, which is the first time that another species is causing an extinction of this scale. So kind of zoos are this lifeline to these endangered animals that we could lose from our planet entirely. So they're very involved in captive breeding programs and reintroduction programs, which we'll tell you a bit more about. But without them, lots more animals could face extinction, I think. So I guess, I mean, maybe let's just put it into context a bit. Do we want to sort of describe what we mean? So the difference, you've got in-situ conservation and ex-situ. Robi, do you just want to explain that so that people are clear?
So these are the kind of two terms which might be a bit strange. I mean, I say this as someone with 2 years of a zoology degree under my belt. I actually was I had them the wrong way around in my head. So this is the kind of terminology that which will come up in this podcast. So in situ means on-site conservation. And so that would be stuff like national parks, biosphere reserves, boots on the ground, as it were, in natural environments. So if we took a lion, in situ lion conservation would be the Masai Mara and, the people who were there tracking the lions and radio collaring and veterinary. That's in situ.
So it's in their natural habitat, basically, for the animals.
Precisely. Whereas we, for this podcast, are actually going to be talking about ex-situ conservation, which literally means off-site conservation. And this is the process of protecting a species or breed or subspecies outside of its natural habitat. And there's a couple of nuances to this point. So it could involve, conserving lions in a zoo in San Diego as opposed to Kenya. That would be ex-situ conservation. But ex-situ conservation can also take place in the natural range of the animal. So the Iberian Lynx conservation program takes place in Spain, which is historically where Iberian lynx lived, but that's still ex-situ because it's taking them out of their natural environment and kind of enclosing them in an artificial environment. Mm-hmm. And so the key things to kind of keep in your mind as we go through this kind of zoo expedition, exploration, whatever you want to call it. When you take an animal and put it in ex-situ conservation, you take it out of its natural niche. So the key processes of evolution and competition no longer occur, and the same selection pressures no longer occur. And you can actually get artificial selection if a population is maintained in situ for quite a while, which is, again, something we're going to come back to later. And so zoos are certainly the most visible kind of element of ex-situ conservation, but it's important to note there's quite a few others as well. So botanical gardens count as ex-situ conservation for plants, as do seed banks. There's that big seed bank. It's in Finland or Sweden, where it's like this big bank in the middle of the snowy mountains, and all the seeds in the world are being dumped there. Gene banks are another good point. The frozen zoo is one of these, which is carrying gene samples from all these endangered species, storing them at ultra low temperatures. That's still ex-situ conservation, even though there's nothing living there. It's just tiny little vials. So it's a very broad church of what you could consider ex-situ. And so zoos, as we're going to go into this now, I think a key issue, and probably one of the key issues for me at least, is the ethics of zoos, because zoos can really be divided into ethical and unethical. So how do we unpack that with ethical zoos, do you think?
Well, there are some kind of typical characteristics associated with an ethical zoo. And primarily these are zoos that prioritise animal welfare, education and conservation efforts above profits potentially. But they're definitely making sure that those three kind of themes are carried all the way through in all the work that they do. So some of the kind of key characteristics to look out for are those professional bodies that we mentioned at the beginning. There's
with
also
the cool names.
Yeah, all the ZARs. There's the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, which is literally AZA, a ZAR. That's an accreditation. You also kind of want to look when you're going around at the enclosures. Do they mimic the animal's natural habitat? How much space do they have? Are they kind of larger enclosures for larger animals or animals who potentially need more space? Is there enrichment to encourage natural behaviours and kind of reduce the boredom and stress of the animals? Kind of other characteristics are ones where animals you've got zoos where animals don't show stereotypical behaviour. So if they're kind of pacing a lot or kind of seemingly stressed, that could be a bit of an alarm bell. It's important to note that even the best zoos may struggle to avoid this though, because individual animals are still individuals at the end of the day. You also kind of want to make sure that there is no regulated kind of touching or physical interaction between animals, or it's extremely regulated. There are obviously some animals that it is more harmful for than others, but it should be a bit of an alarm bell if excessive human interaction is kind of encouraged. Barriers between animals and the public, it might sound like a really obvious thing because you might be picturing a kind of lion in your head and thinking, well, of course there'd be a barrier, but certain animals, certain enclosures, there aren't barriers necessarily, but this could be kind of damaging to the behaviour or the kind of welfare of the animal. Regulated breeding programs of specific animals. Babies are kind of an infrequent occasion and they are announced to the public. You don't want that kind of excessive breeding that makes it seem like a kind of
a farm almost.
Yeah, a farm, yeah. Like
petting
a production
zoo.
line. Yeah, petting zoo. That baby animals get to stay with their mothers. This is a kind of key point, I think, as well, that there's no separation unless it's absolutely necessary. Animals aren't performing tricks. Zoos are not circuses. Zoos are not entertainment parks in that respect. So that's another key thing to look out for. For example, SeaWorld is not a zoo. Lots of educational information about the animals in the wild and the kind of conservation work. So most zoos are really passionate about also working, most kind of ethical zoos, working with people in situ conservation as well. And so that should be really clear as you're walking around. Conservation research is taking place. Zoos are a really great opportunity to be able to study animals kind of up close and also kind of working again with partners in situ, and they should be shouting about that. That shouldn't be hard to find. And also that they have scientists with master's level degrees or PhDs as part of the permanent staff. And I think the easiest way to spot ethical zoos is if you are an ethical zoo, that is a really big USP for you. Not a USP, it shouldn't be a unique selling factor, but if you are an ethical zoo, you will be telling people that. That is something that will get people through the door. So this information shouldn't be hard to come by. And if it is, that should be a bit of an alarm bell.
Yeah, no, definitely agree with that. And I think there are some other alarm bells to look out for, kind of like to maybe flip that on its head as to what we can look for if you have an unethical zoo, because there are lots of them. And so that tends to be where the animals are just being exploited for profit. So it's usually these privately owned zoos or kind of collections of animals where it's usually run by individuals rather than a collection of professional staff and scientists. And because they don't need any accreditation or anything like that, they can have the enclosures however they want, they can handle the animals however they want. And this is very damaging to people's perception of animals, but also to the animals themselves. So an example of this, many of you have probably seen it. I haven't, because I've I know it will disturb me. But Tiger King. So that idea of, I mean, do you guys want to explain a bit more what that is if people haven't seen it?
Yeah, the Tiger King documentary just kind of follows mostly one guy, this guy called Joe Exotic, but also a collection of people who keep large, dangerous mammals basically in their back gardens in the US. He has a massive, I think he has 200 plus big cats in enclosures. They're not just roaming around his garden, but a lot of them are mixed in together. He breeds them, he does cub petting, and he also interbreeds. So he has ligers, which is a lion-tiger cross, which does not exist in the wild. And the focus of the documentary isn't actually even about that. It's more about the crazy interactions between the people. But he always refers to his collection as a zoo, and that is not a zoo.
Not by any stretch of the imagination, no. And I think the fact that all this cub petting goes on is one of the biggest ways. I think probably the most obvious way to discriminate, because a lot of the time it is very hard. To tell, because if the accreditation isn't on display, you might find it quite hard to discriminate between them. But I suppose petting would be the most obvious example.
Yeah, I'd say petting is definitely a key one. Like you mentioned, Kate, with the ethical zoos, births are a rare thing, and if they do happen, the public will know about it. It'll be in newspapers, whereas non-ethical zoos normally have animals kind of as breeding machines year round, so that then there's always a cub or a baby animal that they use not only for petting but also photo opportunities as well. So they market it as come take a picture with a baby animal, that kind of thing. That's a red flag to look out for. And then the idea of enclosures as well, if they're really small, they're not designed for the animals at all. It's just kind of barren small cages. And if there's a lot of, like with the petting, but if there's a lot of emphasis on touching animals as well, that's a big no-no. That is not ethical, not only from a safety point of view, but also we can transmit diseases to animals and they can transmit them to us as well. And kind of a big thing, like you were saying, Kate, with the research, if they're an ethical zoo, they will be upfront about that, and there'll be posters, there'll be talks, there'll be scientists there who you can talk to. Whereas if a zoo is unethical, they're not going to publish any of that. There's not going to be any conservation work, no scientists, no kind of PhDs. I mean, I think even with Tiger King, it was a case of a non-veterinary trained person suturing up a wound on a tiger. They weren't a vet, but if any scientific or veterinary people were to see those conditions, they'd say you can't do this. Yeah.
And even if you are at there are some unethical zoos that will give talks or, they'll give you random facts about these animals that you can obviously go and fact check. And if you ever fact check something you've been told at a zoo or that's on display at a zoo and it's wrong, that's an alarm bell. Because in the Blackfish documentary, another really
the fins
good documentary to watch is they kind of had hidden footage of a SeaWorld guide saying, the lifespan of orcas in the wild and about the percentage of orcas that have a collapsed dorsal fin. And both the stats were completely wrong because because the majority of the orcas at SeaWorld have collapsed dorsal fins. They said that happens to the majority of orcas in the wild. And they also said that orcas only live to about 30, 40 years, which is massively under their lifespan in the wild. Because
especially for females.
Yeah, exactly. Because their orcas only live to 30 to 40 years, and so they wanted to make it sound like they were doing everything they could to mimic this kind of wild. So you should be able to fact check the information that you're given, and if it seems like it's not true, it's always worth checking it out.
And I think don't be afraid to. Like, always question kind of what you're told. Even ethical zoos, it's a good thing to go look up and be like, okay, is this evidence-based? Is it science-led? I think it's good to do that.
Absolutely. And this kind of, that leads quite nicely to kind of a point which always rattles around in my head, is that zoos are quite a controlled environment. And so no matter if it's an ethical zoo or an unethical zoo, animals will always behave slightly differently than they do in the wild. So, for instance, the competitive pressure to access food and water, establish a territory, that almost never, I would imagine, almost would never happen in a zoo because it's all provided for you. So that selection pressure is removed. Prey animals don't have any predation to worry about, by and large. So their behaviour will change as well. Mates are selected for animals. They're not having to go out and, expand their territory to look for them. Territories themselves are stable and usually smaller than in the wild, but you don't have to worry about marking your territory. And what that means is all of these things which take up the majority of an animal's time in the wild, finding food, maintaining a territory, fighting off rivals, escaping from predators, X, Y, and Z, are all being taken care of. And so this kind of, it's quite an interesting thing to think about, but it means that animals in zoos essentially have a load of free time. And so if you're going to be an ethical zoo, what you will need to do is to ensure an animal doesn't become bored or stressed, which can lead to serious behavioural and health issues, such as stereotypical behaviour, like when elephants just stand there swinging their trunks. That's a sign of boredom and stress. And, it's the same for humans. Boredom and stress lead to negative health things, both mentally and physically, exactly the same with animals. And so a really key way to understand if zoos are ethical or not is to how much they invest in enrichment, all these kind of other opportunities to essentially get animals to think and do and move and stretch and exercise and mental stimulation. And I think enrichment is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's honestly crucial, I think, to any zoos that they do have enrichment. I think maybe we can sympathise with that a bit more after having been in lockdown number 3. It's like, imagine if you were just put in a room with nothing to do. Like you've got your food, you've got your water, you can walk around, but like if there's nothing to stimulate you mentally, we would all go insane. I mean, I definitely would if I didn't have anything to do. And so basically what enrichment is referring to is you have these specifically designed objects or activities that are implemented not only for the well-being of animals, but also to allow them to display natural behaviours and also just engage their mental activity as well. So you have, I think it's 5 main types of enrichment that you can have. So you've got food-based, sensory, cognitive, social, and habitat. So kind of food-based would be the way that you feed them. You could distribute it in a more natural way. So with grazers, for example, you could cut the food up really small and spread it out over a large area. So they have to look for it. They don't just get given it in a bowl. Sensory is using things mainly olfactory, so perfumes and things like that, so that they get used to scents and scent marking, which again is a natural behaviour.
Marmite once when I was doing my zookeeper training program.
Really?
We were having to do enrichment for the lions, and obviously a massively olfactory species. The nose is so important to them, and in a zoo, just sitting there, they're not going out and smelling the wildebeest and smelling which way the wind is blowing, and I don't know what a lion smells. Yeah, I could go into it. So we had to get these really long rolls of like carpet rolls, like massive loo rolls, like a metre long, the cardboard bits, and we'd smear them with Marmite, and then we'd throw them into the lion enclosure, and the lions would spend 20 minutes just kind of sniffing it and licking it and trying to get inside it, and all of these great things which really makes them think and burn those calories.
No, that's brilliant. I think that's the thing I love about enrichment is they're so wacky and so varied. I love reading about all the different things that there are.
Yeah.
Because you've also got the interesting ones, which is like cognitive. So kind of like that, I guess, making the lions think. there will be things like feeding puzzles. So I know with toucans we did one where you've got sticks kind of placed in a tube and they have to pull it out to get, like the monkey game. Have you ever played that game where you pull it out and then eventually the food drops? So that helps with mental kind of stimulation. And then you've also, with social enrichment, it could be like putting them with other species or either conspecifics or heterospecifics. And then the last one being kind of habitat enrichment. So if you think of monkeys, apes, they have things to climb on, lots of ropes and things like that. And all of this is basically just designed to improve brain development, reduce stress levels, like you said, Robi, with that stereotypic kind of pacing or head swaying. It's hoped that it reduces that. And just keeping them happy, really, as well, because like we mentioned with zoos being a business, it's like you want people to also see the animals happy, because if they go see the animals being really upset, then they're unlikely to go back.
And there's also you can't ignore enrichment from the side of conservation either, because if you've got these lions and the aim is one day to reintroduce them to the wild, but you don't give them enrichment, then they lose their mental faculties, they lose their fitness, they lose their ability to socialize, they lose their ability to feed properly. They're no longer functionally lions, and there's no chance they'd be able to fill that top predator niche when they return to the wild. So I think enrichment is really important, not just for the animals, but for the long-term goal of conservation as well.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And just to mention this final kind of project, basically, so this is like the idea of zoos being more sustainable, forming partnerships in the future. So it's this project called Repurposing for Enrichment. So basically this is when zoos team up with other companies, and then they use their materials that they would have thrown away. So say they use this big 5-litre gallon plastic water bottle as a warthog enrichment. So it was donated.
How?
I'd put the link in. It's a brilliant video. So they basically coated it to make it look like a tree stump, and they cut holes in and stuck bamboo in, so they could hide food in the middle. So they had to, like, you know how warthogs do, like root stuff up.
Yeah.
And then in the bamboo, because bamboo's hollow, they had things like hay and that kind of grassy stuff. So once they tipped it over, they could eat that as well. So I thought that was a cool use of materials which other people were just going to throw away. So that was
all the carpet rolls for the lions, for that.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant idea.
I think the other one was with lynx. You'd get these big loo rolls, and then this was quite grim. We had to chop up a chick and then mix it in with a load of sheep fur, really stinky sheep fur, and then stuff it in a loo roll. And then lob the loo roll in, and obviously the lynx has then got to spend the next half an hour thinking, how can I get to that? And it was great because it was using all this supermarket waste loo roll things.
No, that's brilliant.
Yeah, that's really clever.
So I guess that's just some things to look out for in zoos, and why enrichment is so important. But maybe do we now want to talk about some examples of like successful or kind of worthy ex-situ conservation projects, so that people are aware of some of the good ones?
Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of shine a light on conservation successes. So the first kind of example I'm going to talk through has the very catchy title of Operation Oryx.
I love it.
I'd
love to have been a member of Operation Oryx.
That sounds so cool.
I just love it when conservation projects start with operation, because it just makes it sound like we're like spies or something. And this was a program designed to save the Arabian Oryx, and it was a captive breeding and reintroduction program. So the last remaining wild Arabian Oryx were actually all captured from the wild and then bred in captivity at San Diego and Phoenix zoos, so in the US. And these numbers were supplemented by animals from private collections. So these private collections came from the Middle East. So 2 were from Taiz in Yemen. 2 females were owned by the Sheikh of Kuwait, and a group of 8 came actually from the King of Saudi Arabia. And upon being bred in captivity in the US, the animals were spread across Europe and North American zoos to prevent a single disease outbreak wiping them out, because obviously this was kind of the last remaining group of this species. So if that had happened, that would have had devastating and kind of irreversible impacts.
You could have lost them all, essentially.
Yeah. So they kind of created this world herd where they had been spread out across Europe and North America, but all within captivity at this point. And then from here, they were actually reintroduced into the wild. And in 2011, it was the first species to ever revert from being extinct in the wild to endangered when you're talking about conservation status classifications by the IUCN, which is really cool because you kind of hear the word extinct and people say extinct is forever, and it is. But extinct in the wild is obviously different to like fully gone. And it's just really awesome to be, any time you kind of improve your conservation status on the IUCN Red List is worthy of celebration, but jumping from extinct in the wild to endangered that's a huge move.
And especially because that would have been skipped critically endangered as well.
Yeah,
so that was just great.
Yeah, so
and I guess that wouldn't have been possible without captive breeding in zoos. Like that would never have happened in the wild.
No,
and in fact, when
not.
they went and captured those last animals from the wild, I can't remember the exact number that they caught. I think it was 4, maybe 6.
Wow.
And they were the last ones. And then there were 4 which they didn't capture because 2 galloped over the border into Oman and 2 went right into the middle of the Dune Sea. They caught them in Saudi Arabia. And those animals were never seen again. And it's thought they were poached. So when they captured them, that was it. And if they'd been even a month later, even a week later, there was a massive influx of poachers to the region. So it was nick of time.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's been successful for sure, because by 2019, it was estimated that there was over 1,000 of them. To think they've gone from between 4 and 8 to over 1,000, and over 7,000 in captivity. So they still have these captive populations to kind of supplement and use in the future if necessary. So yeah, it was a really successful project. Robi, do you want to...
Yeah, I think the Ex-Situ Zoo, which I like the most, is 100% the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, which I visited their headquarters zoo in Jersey.
I'd love to go.
It's genuinely, it's amazing. It's my favourite zoo ever.
Yeah.
We actually should do that. And it's different from other zoos in their kind of ethos. So there's no lions, there's no tigers, there's no rhinos, because, everywhere conserves tigers and rhinos and elephants. Everywhere does that. But their focus is on the kind of the non-charismatic, the forgotten species, just to name a few: the Livingston's fruit bat, the giant jumping rat, the Madagascar teal, the echo parakeet, and the mountain chicken, which is actually a giant frog.
I love that.
And a load of lemurs, stuff like maned wolves and mongooses and things like that, which I really respect, because who thinks of the Madagascar teal or the Bali starling or the lesser Antillean iguana? Everyone thinks of the lions and the stuff. But yes, they have this fantastic zoo on Jersey. So what most impressed me about Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust is the enclosures for the animals. So there's been very little attempt to make the enclosures accessible to the public, because they have quite a lot of private donations. They don't have to worry so much. So if you turn up and you don't see an animal, that's tough. And sometimes you go into one of the lemur enclosures and it's a wall of leaves. And you think, oh my God, I'm never going to see it. And most of the time you don't. I really like that element to it. The other really good element of Durrell, which kind of really distinguishes them in my mind as one of the greatest ethical zoos, is that they support over 50 in-situ conservation programs in around 18 countries worldwide. So they do loads of stuff in Madagascar with lemurs and tortoises. They actually saved the Mauritius pink pigeon and Mauritius kestrel on the ground in Mauritius from extinction. Again, not massive charismatic species, but, worthy of saving in their own right. And I actually visited one of these little conservation programs on the ground in Nameri Wildlife Reserve, which is in the mountain states of Assam in India, for the critically endangered pygmy hog, which is like it's a tiny brown pig. And I thought, fantastic, great, someone's looking out for them. And a really nice example of how this can really pay off is a bird called the Montserrat Oriole, which lives on the island of Montserrat. There was a massive volcanic eruption which wiped out the native population, and it survived because Durrell had a population for captive breeding, and they've since been able to reintroduce it. So Durrell are a really, really good ex-situ conservation organisation. I think
maybe I can sleep easier at night knowing there's people looking out for the little things that everyone else doesn't care about.
They really do look out for the little things, yeah. And another really nice and this is one I haven't been to, so I'm basing my opinion on from online research, is White Oak Conservancy in Florida, which is this massive private, I think it's 17,000 acres of northeastern Florida.
Wow.
and unlike a conventional zoo, they only hold species that are critically endangered or vulnerable due to anthropogenic activity. And its main goal is captive breeding of these populations to supply global conservation initiatives. And it's relatively unknown to the public, but they do a really cool thing. So Dama gazelles, critically endangered in the wild, White Oak have bred them in captivity. 280 calves have been born, and they then, once they've had these calves, they then distribute them to other zoos around the world for those conservation practices. The same thing has been said for cheetahs. They've had over 146 cubs born, and when African national parks, which have lost their cheetahs, want to reintroduce them, they're quite often supplied by White Oak. So I really like this idea. And they do lots of endangered species, like one-horned rhinoes, sandhill cranes, okapi. They're a world leader in okapi conservation.
I like okapi.
So do I. They've had over 90 is a different species, 90 roan antelope, and 25 white rhino calves to be spread to zoos across the world. And my favourite, the eastern bongo, which is the largest of the Tragelaphene forest antelopes. More than 130 calves have been born at White Oak, and 18 have actually been reintroduced to the wild in Mount Kenya. So, for me, that's kind of the gold standard of what a zoo, or at least an ex-situ conservation program, should be.
Yeah, no, I would fully agree with that. It sounds like a really comprehensive. They've kind of thought about the space and the breeding, and yeah. So yeah, I guess another one to mention closer to home. Robi and I don't know if you've been, Kate, but Robi and I both went to Slimbridge. Feels like a while ago now, but several months. But that is part of the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, so WWT. Slimbridge was the first one, kind of. That's where it all started. And I loved going there. Like, it just, to me, that feels like what ex-situ conservation should be like, because yes, they've got the global collections where you've got birds that have their wings clipped and they can't escape. But again,
I think, like,
still,
the flamingos. They've got. Yeah. I think haven't they got every species of flamingo in the world there?
Yeah, I think so. I love the flamingos.
I didn't know there were that many flamingos. I turned up and I was like, hang on, there's like 8. What is this?
I know, I was like, there's an Andean flamingo? What? But it's like, even the ones that do have their wings clipped is in very big enclosures, and obviously because they can't fly away, there's no fences. So it's just these big pools, and what I liked about it is kind of a mixture between ex-situ and in-situ, because the idea is to restore these massive wetland areas. So they've kind of called it this blue recovery that they want to work towards, as well as the green recovery. They're not hating on the green recovery, they just also like the wetlands. And the idea that they've restored these incredible ecosystems, which are wetlands, that wild species are now coming in their thousands every year on migratory routes. And you can see them from hides, but these are wild species of birds that are coming in. So it's this nice mixture, I think. And just an amazing, amazing guy as well who founded it. He's called Sir Peter Scott. And I didn't realise, actually, he was the creator of the IUCN Red List. And he also was the one who drew the panda logo on the WWF thing.
So he's not a very good artist. So I really shouldn't slag him off. He's also the guy who wrote one of my favourite books, the foreword to The Conservation and Biology of Desert Antelopes, which details Operation Oryx. So he was involved with that as well. Funny how all these things go around.
Oh wow! Just really, really varied. And what I like about this one is, like we were saying, with what makes a good ethical zoo. So they are part of this Biasa accreditation. They do loads and loads of research and give talks and presentations about the importance of wetlands. So just in case you didn't know, so 40% of all species on the planet rely on freshwater wetlands, but they only cover 1% of the world's surface. So that's why they're trying to regenerate wetlands. And create, this blue recovery thing. So that's one that I was really, really impressed by here in the UK.
Yeah, those are all like really awesome projects, and I think they kind of show that these things can be successful. So we're kind of going to run through now some of the kind of benefits of these ex-situ conservation projects that have enabled these successes that we've just spoken about. So one of the first ones and really important ones is that ex-situ conservation can provide a reservoir for endangered species. So as you kind of mentioned with the Montserrat Oriole, which was saved by the Royal Conservation Trust, as Robi's just spoken about, and many species actually need captive populations. It's this kind of classic don't keep all your eggs in one basket scenario. So the fact that there are no captive individuals for certain species like Sumatran and Javan rhinos is part of the reason they're so endangered, because there's no surviving individuals across the world. So their entire fate remains on the wild populations, which are limited to such fragmented areas. Another kind of example is a critically endangered species of newt. It's the Montsennet Brook newt, I think is the correct pronunciation.
I have never heard of that before. Tell me about the Montsennet Brook newt.
Yeah, so there was a study to kind of evaluate and analyse the genetic representation of a captive breeding program of this newt, which is it's an Iberian endemic, and they are critically endangered. And they basically found that this captive population that they had had 74 to 78 of the alleles present in the wild population, and that the captive population roughly represented 93 to 95% of the wild population's total genetic diversity.
So that's quite a lot.
A previous study, which it is a lot.
I'm not a geneticist, but it sounds pretty good.
It is a lot, but the kind of generally agreed desirable level of genetic diversity for a captive population to capture is actually 97.5.
Oh, they missed it by two and a half.
Yeah, so they basically fall short. And so this study concluded that the genetic diversity of the captive stock should be improved by incorporating genetic material from wild newts, so from unrelated wild population. So what they were saying is bring wild populations into captivity in order to up the genetic diversity of the captive population so that they would be able to kind of do what the Oryx has done. And this might seem counterintuitive, but because the species is so endangered, there is this need for captive population in order to survive. And if you're going to have a captive population for the purposes of rewilding, you want them to be as fit as possible, which is why genetic diversity is so important. And there's also, an argument to be made and kind of evidence to suggest that incorporating wild individuals actually slows the adaptation to captivity, which is something that we're going to discuss a little bit later on.
Yeah, no, and I think maybe leading on from that, it's kind of a similar point, but this idea of maximising genetic diversity is crucial in captive populations. And the way that you can do this for any animal, but maybe importantly for endangered species, is the use of things called stud books, which I think if you work in zoos, I went and did a 2-week course at Bristol Zoo, and the take-home word of the course was stud books. So
do you know a really fun fact?
Yeah, go on then.
Do you know a really fun fact? So my A-level biology teacher, who knew I wanted to be a zoologist and wanted to go on and do zoology at university, and really helped me through my A-level biology, which I found quite hard. At the end of it, literally just before I was about to go to university, she said, "Yeah, I used to manage the Australian big cat stud book." And I was like, "What? How?" And she was like, "Yeah, I just did that in Australia for a bit." And I was like, "Oh my god, you're amazing." Anyway, it's a complete tangent, sorry.
No, but I think that that highlights well that it's a whole role. Like managing these stud books is so complicated. So basically what a stud book is, it's like all the documented records of the genetic diversity between captive individuals. So you use this to look at who you can breed with which animal you can breed with which other animal, so that you maintain this high genetic diversity. So, for example, with, say, the Iberian lynx, you have really, really low genetic diversity in the wild, but because you have the captive individuals that are all documented in the stud book, this allows researchers to mate different pairs that are the most distantly genetically related. So it maintains this high genetic diversity. And you need this, because imagine if you didn't know which animals were related to each other, then you could end up with inbreeding, you can end up with genetic bottlenecks. So I think, stud books are crucial in ex-situ conservation.
And I guess, the other thing is all of these are benefits for the species and the environment, but there's also a benefit for humans with ex-situ conservation in that you get to meet these animals. I mean, maybe you shouldn't meet them face to face and, dress them up and take photos with them. That's wrong. But as we've said before, and I'm only going to touch on this because we did say it before earlier on, there's such a value for engagement, and especially youth engagement, because we three are literally testaments. If you can hook a kid on animals when he's young, she'll grow up to be save the pandas and the rhinos, and it's our generation and the generation after us who are now going to be the ones who have to clean up this climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis. There's a really nice quote from David Attenborough, the one true God, that no one will ever protect what they don't care about, and no one will care about what they have never experienced. So I think no matter your opinion on zoos, you cannot deny that they do have a very strong public engagement role, and I think the benefits of that shouldn't be discounted. And another benefit is obviously fundraising. Zoos generate a lot of money, and they can support people all around the world in their conservation. And especially, we know that conservation will only really succeed if local people who live in the environments where their animals and habitats are endangered engage with conservation and indeed become leaders in it. In the same way that we know that the emancipation and education of women is really the only thing which will ever end poverty, we're not going to win this conservation crisis without all the people involved who live in the places where the animals are. That was a really long tangent, sorry. But an instance of this is the San Diego Zoo has a global initiative which supports grassroots conservationists around the world. One who we've spoken about before is Dr. Ekwoje Abwe, as a postdoctoral fellow in population sustainability. And he's a local Cameroonian who is at the front line of protecting the Igbo forest in Cameroon.
Oh, this guy's so cool.
Yeah, Igbo forest dude. And he's straight out, he won a Whitley Award for his work. But he also came out and said, look, I couldn't do this work without the support of an international zoo. And again, so whatever you kind of think about zoos, you can't deny that their ability to empower local conservationists around the world in a way that hasn't happened historically is really, really important, and I don't think should be forgotten at all.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really cool and really valid point to bring in the kind of social element. Another real benefit of zoos is that they allow for protection for certain species from kind of predators and from poaching. The kind of resources that zoos have available to them and the staff does allow this sort of level of protection and kind of create a safe haven for certain species and a secured population that's more likely to survive. Obviously, where there's a will, there's a way. This isn't always the case. And, tragically, in 2017, for the first time in Europe, a live captive animal was poached in Paris when poachers broke into a zoo and killed a 4-year-old rhino and stole its horn. But that was the first time this has happened in Europe, and as far as I know, it hasn't happened since. And generally, on the whole, zoos do allow this sort of level of protection, but nothing can be 100% all of the time.
And I guess with your point on rhinos, one of the most poached animals in the world, it's a lot easier to provide security to 2 rhinos in a paddock in Berlin than it is to patrol the entirety of Kruger National Park, for instance.
Yeah.
So those, we hope that's given you an appreciation of the positives, not just of zoos, but of ex-situ conservation as a wider concept. But now, in the interest of balance and fairness and kind of what this whole podcast is about, we're going to talk to you about maybe some of, I guess you'd call them the cons. We've just done the pros. We're now going to do the cons of ex-situ conservation. So I think the biggest one that springs to mind is genetics. We've just said all the positives of genetics, but genetics in zoos can have a downside as well, can't it?
Yeah, no, massively, and I think it's good to address both sides. But loss of genetic diversity can be a big problem in captive populations, because animals in captivity, it's often founded from very few individuals. So you could actually get what's called a genetic bottleneck, which is when the population size is so low that there really isn't any genetic diversity left in order to sort of maintain the fitness of the population. So it makes it very, very difficult for species to survive if you've got this genetic bottleneck. I mean, it is possible for species to get out of it. So cheetahs have survived 2 genetic bottlenecks throughout history, but you risk things of inbreeding, and even in humans there's examples of what goes wrong with that. You start to get malformations and deformities and just a reduction in fitness overall. So as much as captive breeding does benefit genetics, and it can, like we talked about the stud book, it's well managed, you need to make sure that this is not at the cost of the captive population. So it could help wild populations, but if you're pushing the captive population into a bottleneck, then maybe we need to think about that as a con. And then I guess just a quick one to mention, something we've talked about a lot is kind of rewilding, reintroductions. We're all quite big advocates for that. And so that, but there are issues with translocation. So even if you think about, say reintroduction programs, for example, there are lots of costs that are associated with this. So I don't mean just in terms of money, but just the number of mortality that you get, the amount of mortality in transit, the amount of stress. It's very, very stressful moving animals from one place to another, and then we just expect them to establish themselves perfectly in this new habitat that we've been like, this is a great place for you to live, go live here. And in the case of the elephants, when they did that, they went straight back home. Like, they wanted to go home because
and can you blame them?
No, not at all.
Yeah, and it's interesting your point on genetics with the cheetahs. You know, cats are really quite an interesting way to look at that, because they're very complicated when it comes to their genetics. Cheetah populations now from different parts of Africa are allegedly so closely related due to these bottlenecks that you can skin graft between individuals and with no issues there. Whereas, you know, Iberian lynx have gone through a massive population bottleneck and maintained it over something like 50,000 years with no ill effects. It's very strange. But wildcats, European wildcats, as I understand, I don't know much about it, but there's also a genetic impact on them in captivity, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. So they are a least concerned species, but they have a declining population, and the wild populations are fragmented. So these cats are bred in zoos, these European wildcats, and many captive individuals have been reintroduced to Germany to supplement the wild populations and increase genetic diversity. Sounds great, but there was no kind of coordinated breeding program or stud book. So when they did some genetic testing on the captive individuals, they found that 68% of them shared common mitochondrial DNA haplotypes with domestic cats. And haplotypes are basically groups of genes within an organism inherited from a single parent. So basically what this meant was that the captive population was somehow breeding with domestic cats. Therefore, they could not be recommended for reintroduction because they are now a hybrid species, which kind of highlights the need for this effective study and stud books even more so, because you need to be really organised from the beginning. And if you're starting a new program, you really need to test the genetics of the founder individuals to avoid a bottleneck and to make sure that those individuals are kind of fit for purpose. Another kind of just like quick genetic implication of ex-situ conservation as well is the potential for adapting to captivity. And this kind of largely depends on selection intensity, genetic diversity, the founder population, effective population size, and the kind of number of generations in captivity, because species which have spent many generations in captivity are likely to suffer more from adaptation to captivity and its kind of impacts on reintroduction success. But this is sort of less of an issue if reintroduction isn't your aim. Obviously, it's a shame to see wild animals adapt to captivity, but if reintroduction isn't on the cards at all, then kind of a slight adaptation doesn't really have an impact in terms of conservation. It's more a concern for the welfare of that animal.
And I guess that's an interesting point. You know, adaptation to captivity, because what that implies is a loss of ability to function in the wild. And so that's a really key problem. And again, I'm just going to use another big cat as an example. So it's a really big problem affecting the South China tiger, which is a population of mainland tiger subspecies, which is almost certainly extinct in the wild. Even if a few exist, there's no chance they're going to reproduce and have a population. So they only exist in captivity, and there's around 70 to 100 of them. And a really big issue with this is they live in captivity, and because you can't feed live vertebrate prey to carnivores by and large, those tigers have then lost the ability to hunt, which is a massive obstacle in the way of their rewilding and reintroduction. Because if you dump 70 South China tigers in the wild which can't hunt, you're going to have 70 dead South China tigers, and then you'll be even worse than where you started off.
Yeah.
So there's a really interesting project which is trying to kind of mitigate this and using a kind of rewilding vibe as well at the same time. So a non-governmental organisation called Save China's Tigers has this plan to reintroduce these tigers to the wild, and their first step is teaching them all how to hunt, because they've all been bred in captivity as well. It's not just teaching them how to hunt, it's how to live in a wild environment. And so what they do, they partnered with South Africa. A few of the tigers have been brought to a private reserve in South Africa called Lauhu Valley Reserve to train them to be wild once more. And it's this classic big African reserve with lots of wild prey running about. So the offspring of those trained tigers will be raised on that reserve and then released into the wild, whilst the original animals brought to South Africa will stay there to keep breeding and keep teaching their cubs how to hunt. And you can imagine why South Africa was chosen, because they've got a lot of expertise with big cats in reserves, got lots of prey, yada yada yada. And so it's been quite successful. They've produced 11 surviving cubs. So there's around 20 South China tigers, wild South China tigers, which can hunt and fend for themselves on this reserve in South Africa. And so, yeah, it's been a bit, as ever with rewilding, it's been a bit contentious. So quite a few mainstream conservation organisations, including WWF, have said this isn't worth it. You're putting the money in the wrong place. The Siberian tiger, which does still exist in the wild, is got a better chance of survival. However, there's a chap called Dr. David Smith of Minnesota University who visited Lauhu Valley and said, having seen these tigers hunting, I believe they can hunt anywhere. So it's kind of a toss-up. And, suitable habitat has been found in China for them to pop up. And I actually disagree with WWF's assessment here. Whilst I agree...
That's quite bold.
Yeah, I know. I realised I just said that on a podcast. Please don't sue me. Whilst I agree that the Siberian tiger has a better chance of survival objectively than the South China tiger, I still believe it's worth investing in the South China tiger. Not just for its own sake, although I think it does have a right to be at least someone try to save it, but also because reintroducing the South China tiger will help restore native and degraded Chinese ecosystems. We know China is now reassessing its environmental impact and its policy. It's been making some very promising overtures towards this. And I think, top-down control, bringing tigers back into these ecosystems could really help kind of reinvigorate these environments. And so for me, it's not just about the tiger. The tiger's the tool which you can use to help to restore the whole ecosystem. And so I think it's worth it. This whole tiger thing brings us to a really interesting problem in that we can't, our laws at the moment say we can't feed live prey to carnivores, live vertebrate prey at least. I quite strongly disagree with this because if you've got lions in a zoo in Birmingham, Alabama, wherever, I think you should be able to feed it live prey if it's a domestic animal. I quite firmly believe that the life of a single goat is not greater than the potential value of having, say, a tiger with its full battery of hunting instincts. The goat has little value to its species because it's not endangered, and it has little value to an ecosystem because it's a domestic animal, whereas a tiger with fully predatory adaptations has tremendous value, both to the conservation of its own species and also to potentially improve the health of whatever ecosystem it might be reintroduced to further down the line. But that's a little caveat of my own.
No, I think I would agree, and just like you just mentioned with the example of the South China tiger, it's like if we're taking away live prey and that hunting instinct, likely to lose it altogether if you're just as much as enrichment can help stimulate the way they feed and make them look for it, make them work for their food, it doesn't substitute catching live prey. Because we had issue with this when I was working in a sanctuary. We had a hawk, and legally you're not allowed to release live mice prey into the enclosure with it, because the mice can't escape and therefore it's not ethical. But it's like, if you're going to reintroduce that into the wild, how do you ever expect it to be able to hunt and catch rodents again if you can't do that? So I kind of agree with you, Robi. I think if the enclosure is big enough, if the animal has somewhere to hide, if it can escape, then I think maybe that should be reconsidered, because like you say, the ability of a tiger or a lion to be able to hunt is possibly worth more than the value of the life of the single goat.
And, you know, absolutely, the goat shouldn't just be tied up like it is for the T-Rex in Jurassic Park, because that's not actually helping the tiger to hunt either. It's got to have, you know, you've got to have a big enclosure, and the goat's got to be able to run away, and tiger's got to think, okay, follow the goat. And, you know, there's a couple of other caveats with zoos and the kind of the potential negative impacts of them. So overpopulation of captive species is one which got quite a lot of social media attention when I don't quite know what year it was, but Copenhagen Zoo euthanized a perfectly healthy giraffe, and they had too many giraffes. There was no one to buy this giraffe, this other zoo. It couldn't be moved, and it wasn't genetically diverse enough to help breeding in a captive population. So that's one other concern. And the other is that zoos are expensive. Animal food is expensive. If you've got a panda, you've got to have bamboo. I don't know if they grow it in wherever, or do they have to import it from the natural habitat? I don't know. Meat for carnivores must be of a high quality.
And just fruit as well. The quantity of fruit for primates, birds, it's
absolutely
very, very large. And then, another cost I guess you've got to consider is the spread of disease. So you've got not only animals coming into contact with other species that they might not in the wild, that has to be managed carefully, but also if it's maybe not a fully ethical zoo, you've got the risk of humans transmitting diseases to the animals as well. So that's just something that needs to be considered, and that's why you need welfare and veterinary checks as well.
And so we've now come to the last kind of 15-minute chunk of this podcast, and this is where we're going to kind of go into our opinions. We hope we've provided a nice balance of kind of the positives of Ex-Situ Conservation and the negatives of which you might get. So now, I think the question, which has probably been in all of our minds, is sort of a kind of issue of speciesism. Zoos, we kind of all agree, are necessary, but is your opinion the same for all species? Do you think all species should be kept in zoos? What do we think?
Well, so, okay, I'll start and then I can go over to you again, Robi, if you want. But basically the answer to that is no for me, that my opinion changes sort of significantly depending on the species. And I think sort of that large, highly intelligent animals that need big territories in the wild shouldn't really be kept in zoos, maybe apart from a handful of individuals that could act as flagship species. So this is kind of the way that I see zoos moving forward, is this idea of keystone species or flagship species, rather than just it's assumed that you're going to have elephants, rhinos, polar bears, just because they're there. But if we could have bigger enclosures, more natural enclosures, say for example like Woodland Valley Farm down in Cornwall, which again it's not a zoo, but where you've got a pair of beavers that have been released there, and it's a very large enclosure, display all their natural behaviours. They can build dams, they can regulate water flow, and this is almost like a demonstration of what they can provide service-wise in terms of ecosystem functions. So people can still go, they have educational talks, they have lots of information, but you can actually see the benefits of that species in the wild, because I think that's removed completely when you have animals in cages and you don't get to see any of the natural behaviours. So I think something like that beaver project, and also species like bison, for example, with the Wild Ableem project, that's kind of species I would like to see people engaged with. I think people need to be aware of what we've lost in terms of ecosystem services by these amazing animals. But have them in large enclosures where they can display their natural behaviours, I think that still serves an education purpose.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Kate?
Yeah, I would say my opinion is not the same for all species. I do think there are certain species that are exempt and should not be kept in captivities, like, you know, orcas, dolphins, because I just think these animals are, it just doesn't work, and we don't have the resources to keep them in captivity to a kind of sufficient level for their welfare. However, overall, I am a big proponent of ethical zoos. I think their value to conservation is actually often understated, and I believe that the public access to wild animals is really important in inspiring people. And that David Attenborough quote that we kind of said earlier has always really, really stuck with me. And I've been very privileged in the wild encounters I've had, but I'm very aware that that is definitely not something that everyone has access to or, you know, would choose to necessarily spend their money on. But I do think that allowing people to see these animals themselves is really important, and the kind of genetic values of zoos as well really does, I really believe in that, and I think having these captive populations for real wilding is really important and a really valuable tool just for conservation in general that, again, I think is slightly overlooked when people talk about zoos. So overall, yes, the species does matter, but my kind of general opinion towards zoos is more positive than you might expect from a conservationist, I guess, or from an animal lover, because people yeah.
I think I would agree with you. I think my opinion towards zoos, ethical zoos, certainly is much more positive than it is negative. My feelings regarding species largely depend, as they usually do, on the conservation status of the species in question. I have no problem with non-endangered or domestic animals being kept in zoos, and I recognise that have immense public engagement and relations value. I think if you're going to keep endangered animals in captivity, then public engagement alone is not a sufficient reason for its captivity. I think it must also be actively engaged in captive breeding, reintroduction, conservation programs, genetic conservation, stuff like that. You know, we say this a lot, but the biodiversity crisis is at such an extent that I don't think we have the luxury of just having pandas in captivity and not breeding them, or not seriously trying to conserve their wild habitats so we can reintroduce them. So yeah, I think I'm all for ethical zoos. I think if they're going to have endangered species, that it has to be 100% geared towards that captive breeding program. There is a caveat to this, because like that giraffe in Copenhagen Zoo, there are many individuals of highly endangered species that have no conservation value, either because poor genetics or they're post-reproductive, so they're not breeding anymore. And I wouldn't euthanize them. I say, okay, well, right, they're a flagship for public engagement. So that's kind of my opinion on the species. And I guess then the follow-up question to that is, you know, do we think all zoos are the same, and do we value them the same way?
No, I mean, for me, I saw you shaking your head there, Kate. Like, I fully agree with that. Like, I think particularly doing research into this and looking more into the ethical and unethical zoos, I would never want to support or visit an unethical one. They just make me feel uncomfortable. But there's an element to, I've never entirely felt comfortable going to zoos. And I think we've mentioned this before, that we are in a privileged position to say that we've been able to see animals in the wild. Not everyone has that opportunity, and it's very, very fortunate that we have been able to. But once you've seen them in their natural habitat in the wild, it's very, very hard to see them in zoos and think that that's okay. So for me, that doesn't sit hugely well, because it feels a bit like confinement. But in places like cities, for kids in urban areas, I think zoos do hold an important education and conservation purpose. And all the funky name things that we talked about, I think that...
Wazza!
Wazza! And Biaza! And I think... So if you are looking at going to zoos and supporting zoos, I would only want to do that if they are, in the UK, if they are Biaza accredited, because that means they're putting in effort into conservation and research, and it's science-led. And like you were saying, Robi, I think zoos like the Durrell... Is it Durrell Zoo or Durrell Conservation?
It's Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, who operate Jersey Zoo. But
Right.
I think most people just say Durrell Zoo or Jersey Zoo. People know what you mean.
Yeah.
Okay. So, say with Durrell Zoo, the idea that the enclosures are designed entirely from an animal perspective. So I would almost feel happier if I went to a zoo and I didn't see the animal, just because I know that the enclosure's designed so well that it's got places to hide, and that would make me happier. But then obviously it is a balance because it is a business. But I think places like that and places like the WWT, like Slimbridge, to me, you can still have incredible wildlife experiences, but it just takes away kind of the fences and the enclosure side of aspects, and it can still engage a large number of people. So I think zoos do serve a purpose, but I think they need reform. And also, in my mind, I think we should be looking at making our wider landscapes wilder, so that we can actually see animals in their natural environment rather than behind bars. So that's kind of my take.
What about you, Robi? Do you think all zoos are the same?
I very much don't. I really recognise that zoos, as a concept, have really important conservation value. I personally only feel comfortable visiting a select few which do visibly prioritise conservation over viewer experience. Durrell being one, WWT at Slimbridge, and I'd like to visit White Oak. But at the same time, I acknowledge that even zoos which perfectly balance conservation and viewer experience, I don't think they should be poo-pooed, and I think they have a great conservation value. And the uncomfortable truth is, until zoos get government funding, which I would absolutely do if I was Prime Minister, they have to rely on public fees and therefore have to prioritise to some extent public experience. I'm in no position to deny them that or say that they do not do important conservation and awareness work, which they absolutely do. So it kind of poses the question, which is more important, conservation of endangered species or animal ethics and welfare, which is a whole other podcast. Again, in an ideal world, you wouldn't have zoos. You'd have just Durrells and White Oaks and things like that, or Blean, which we talk about with the bison. But we don't live in an ideal world. We have to work with what we've got. I not only think zoos are necessary, I worry that if we got rid of zoos, ethical and unethical, we would also doom in situ conservation. So I'm coming out, and I'm with the zoos on this one. The ethical zoos, obviously. Tiger King is a no-no.
Yeah. I definitely agree that with what you just said, I think you put that so nicely. If we got rid of kind of ex-situ conservation, we would doom in-situ conservation. I think that's I really liked that.
Thank you. I tried.
Yeah, I definitely I agree with. I agree with most of what you both just said. I definitely don't think all zoos are the same. Tiger King is not a zoo. I think it's kind of insulting to zoos that he even refers to his garden as a zoo. And my positive opinion of zoos does obviously only hold true for ethical and accredited zoos. And I do agree with you, Emma, in respect that I don't always feel entirely comfortable at any zoo, but I do think that that's on the kind of flip side to what we were talking about being incredibly privileged to see these animals in the wild. I think once you've seen them in the wild, it's harder to see them in captivity sometimes, and because it just won't ever compare. And although it's still amazing to be able to go to a zoo and see a lion, it's not the same as seeing it in its natural habitat. So I think that's, for me, something that I just I don't really feel the need to go to zoos to see animals, but that's because of the job I have, which is incredibly niche. I understand that. And I do think the welfare of the animals is the utmost important. But again, as you just said, Robi, I think this whole podcast series, one thing we're coming up against time and time again is sometimes conservation and animal welfare, although they are always, on the same team, there is sometimes this, do we prioritise the conservation of biodiversity or the welfare of individual animals? And that's a really hard question to reconcile with. But it's something that kind of conservationists do have to think about almost every day.
So hopefully that has given you a good overview of zoos and ex-situ conservation as a whole, some of the positives, some of the negatives, some things to think about. So we thought we'd end just with a bit of positive news, sort of cutting edge. I think this is almost like futuristic style research. It's incredible what they've been able to achieve, and this is looking at saving species from extinction and even bringing back species which have been extinct for hundreds of years. So it's very, very cool. So basically this is kind of the work of the Leibniz Institute for Zoo and Wildlife Research, also in collaboration with a zoo in the Czech Republic. You've got Italian laboratories working on it. You've got Kenyan Wildlife Services involved in this. And this is basically generating northern white rhino embryos from skin cells that we have of other rhinos.
So cool.
So it just baffles me that this is
so
possible. So this is very new, cutting-edge research. They've realised that you can turn skin cells back into stem cells. So those are your undifferentiated cells that can be turned into anything. And they can then be turned into gametes, which is your sex cells, so your sperm and your eggs. And then they can then be fused in vitro to form a viable embryo. And then you could implant this in a surrogate species and use this to bring back extinct species, because if we have the skin cells, there's a chance of
I love it when you were
bringing
saying
the
that
species
Kate the
back.
rhino lady was like, so cool, so
Incredible.
cool. So
It's just so clever.
So thank you all very much for listening. To catch up and stay up to date with more Biome content, you can check out our website, which is www.biome-project.co.uk. On Spotify, we are the Biome Podcast. And if you'd like to see more from us, we do lots and lots of cool wildlife things. On Instagram, we are at Robi Watkinson Wildlife, at Emma Hodson Wildlife, and at Conservation Kate on Instagram. So as ever, let us know your comments and thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. What do you guys think about zoos? And we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.